Guten Morgen, willkommen to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Beautiful morning here in Los Angeles. How you guys doing out there? Did anybody else see that the gun that Paul Verlaine used to shoot Arthur Rimbaud is up for auction? I think they estimate that it could go upwards of like 50,000 pounds. I don't know what the exact conversion rate is in US dollars, but anybody who buys that gun from me can shoot me with it. Hope you guys are having a nice fall. I decided that some Gothic literature was essential as we count down the days to Halloween, Samhain, Dia de los Muertos, the holidays of the dead. Yeah, it's a good time of year. Although it's not as cold as I'd like it to be. It's like 90 here, I think, in the afternoons. Yesterday it was hot as fuck. From doing research for this review, I've discovered that nobody can actually pinpoint the origins in the literary world of the vampire concept. You know, the first vampire story that we have in English is from John Polidori, who was the doctor for Lord Byron. He was Lord Byron's doctor, and he wrote a story called The Vampire, you know, with a Y, which is erroneously attributed to Lord Byron, actually, sometimes. But it was this guy named John Polidori. I think he committed suicide at like 25 from gambling debts. Really interesting story going on there in and of itself. But he was the very first. After that, we have this wonderful, very short, brilliant Gothic masterpiece by this Irishman, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, which precedes Dracula by Bram Stoker, a fellow Irishman, by about 26 years. So, if you wanted to say, like, what was the very first proper vampire story, novel, you know, yeah, you could say the one by John Polidori, but, you know, this is really where things start to get, like, honed in, where you see so many elements of Gothic literature displayed prominently, composed to present this atmosphere which is so distinct and distilled. You could probably argue, of course, because he was a fellow Irishman, that Bram Stoker was probably influenced by Carmilla. You know, and of course Dracula contains the most iconic Gothic literature archetype character of all time, you know, next to Shelley's Frankenstein, but that's later. So, you had this first wave of Gothic literature, but then it sort of it didn't really take off until like the 1890s and the second wave. And Carmilla is set, you know, kind of betwixt these first and second waves in 1872, I think. But, you know, after it kind of resurged, after it resurfaced, after it was revitalized, which in no small way is totally appropriate considering, you know, its content about, you know, death, and especially questioning the limits of death, and the most common theme is like things that are dead that return to life. After that, it never really left. It's still popular to this day, obviously. So you've seen so many iterations of these kinds of stories throughout the last century that it's impossible to even like come to a number. Every single culture, all over, and you know, in fact, there's this brilliant lecture by David Punter, who's an expert. He's at the University of Bristol. He's an expert on Gothic literature. He says, I love this fucking quote, "There is no culture in the world which is free from ghosts, or the fear of ghosts, or from the belief in ghosts, and there never has been." I love that. It's amazing. So before we get into this specific novel, you may ask, what exactly constitutes a Gothic novel, right? Well, impending death, of course, old ancient family bloodlines and crypts, old things in general, i.e. things suggesting death, the desire for long dead or disintegrating cultures, occasionally people, archetypes of virginal purity, taboo, madness, the sacrilegious, sometimes the satanic or the damned, the threat of disease, which is sort of like a post-bubonic plague thing after 1349 when that emerged and killed off a fuckload of people. I'd wager all of this is stuff that Gothic literature is made up of. Of course, the beautiful thing is its imaginative evolution throughout the centuries. But it is very distinctly of European origin. You really can't get more European than the Gothic novel. We even have this at work in French literature. You could argue that the work of Sade, of Baudelaire, of Rimbaud, J.K. Huysmans, the infamous L'Autrement, or my own patron saint Georges Bataille. All of this could kind of fall. They're in the realm of the Gothic novel. Many of their works. So there's elements at work, and there's obviously influence from Gothic novels throughout 20th century fiction, 21st century fiction, everywhere. Everywhere. There's even a political thing going on here in the elements of the early Gothic novels because of the, as Punter says, the clarity of the Protestant sort of is pitted against the murky darkness of Catholicism. And Catholicism contributes a great deal to the Gothic novel, with the whole, asceticism and mortification of the flesh, and kind of just the tragedy of the whole religion. And so these castles, which are usually the setting, are sort of like the residue of a feudal or aristocratic past. You should definitely watch this lecture by David Punter here. It's magnificent if you're interested in knowing more about the history of the Gothic novel. But back to Carmilla. Okay, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu lived in Dublin, a very Gothic city in its own right, of course, with all of this religious tension going on way back when. I've been lucky enough to explore it a little bit, but the weather, the rain, the cold, the fog, the gray, you have the trees, which are large and ominous gray and black stone churches, these cobblestone streets everywhere, these little bridges over rivers, crumbling cemeteries, classic Gothic setting. So Le Fanu actually wrote Carmilla during, I think, the period of the last 10 years of his life when he was very, very productive. And this was after he had lost his mother, and then shortly before that, he had lost his wife. So very dark period. Extremely productive, but very dark. I think he wrote 14 books in the last 10 years of his life. So ideas and literature and stories that were fueled probably not in the least by the loneliness of the tragedies that befell him. In no short way did Carmilla influence the erotic nature of the vampire lore. Though it's subtle by today's standards, back then I'm sure it was considered a lot more risque. Gothic literature began, many say, with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which is actually based on a real house that Walpole himself built called Strawberry Hill in London. You should go check out these photos of it. It's spread into many distinct flavors around the world. And then, of course, you have Emily Bronte and Charlotte Bronte of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, of course. Magnificent Gothic novel. Then you go there from science fiction and horror fiction, the illustriously horrifying bleak H.P. Lovecraft, and weird fiction, plenty of ghost stories, Algernon Blackwood, Ambrose Bierce. Then it moves on in the 20th century up to the American Southern Gothic novel with Faulkner and Richard Brautigan and all this stuff. At the same time, you have all these pulp and trashy dime store novels, and then it leads to the 80s to young adult teen horror fiction and Stephen King and all this stuff. Up until today, we have so many permutations of it. Looking at other vampire novels around that era, Carmilla is what you might call a little bit sapphic, comparatively. Two beautiful young women locked away in a dark castle, one of whom which wants to imbibe the other's precious life fluids. It begins like thus. In Styria, part of Austria, in Styria, we, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a castle or schloss. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. £800 or £900 a year does wonders. Scantily enough, ours would have answered among wealthy people at home. My father is English, and I bear an English name, although I never saw England. But here, in this lonely and primitive place, where everything is so marvelously cheap, I really don't see how ever so much more money would at all materially add to our comforts, or even luxuries. So immediately you can determine this sort of young, naive, wealthy young girl who's locked away in this castle in the middle of the woods in Austria. Laura, our protagonist, who falls victim to Mircalla, or Carmilla, as she uses anagrams throughout the story. So she lives in this part of Austria, which was previously inhabited historically by the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths. One time it was conquered by the Huns. Before that, Celtic tribes lived there. So violent, dark, bleak, kind of austere history. Perfect location for a Gothic novel. Nothing can be more picturesque or solitary. It stands on a slight eminence in a forest. The road, very old and narrow, passes in front of its drawbridge. Never raised in my time, and its moat, stocked with perch, sailed over by many swans, and floating on its surface, white fleets of water lilies. Over all this, the Schloss shows its many-windowed front, its towers, and its Gothic chapel. You're going to find sentences in this book which conjure the image of an anemic Vincent Price wasting away in a castle by the sea, of course. That's exactly why it's brilliant. Because these are the origins of all the Gothic cliches, right? This is the smack before it was cut. This is pure stuff. And if you allow yourself to enjoy it, it's a magnificent trip, I dare say. Par exemple, the sun was setting with all its melancholy splendor behind the sylvan horizon, and the stream that flows beside our home and passes under the steep old bridge I have mentioned wound through many a group of noble trees, almost at our feet, reflecting in its current the fading crimson of the sky. If sentences like that don't turn on the 15-year-old goth inside of you, I'm sorry, you can leave. We all advanced in curiosity and horror, me rather in silence, the rest with various ejaculations of terror. Oh man, so good. So classic. So history is crucial for Gothic literature, again. Previously enforced taboos being broken and things once thought dead that apparently aren't actually dead. Flashback. So when Laura is a child, she sees this apparition of this beautiful woman inside of her bedroom, and then she feels a bite and it scares her, and then 12 years pass, and then there's this carriage accident with these travelers outside of this castle, and this girl is injured and she has to stay with them. And guess who it is? Yes, the girl she saw from when she was a young girl. So of course you know the story. She moves in, the girls bond, and then all of a sudden strange things start happening around the town with all of the lowly peasants dying. The women and the young girls begin dying, and the funeral procession goes by the castle, and it enrages Mircalla or Carmilla, which I forget which one she's going by at that point. Laura begins having visions, and Carmilla begins acting darkly flirtatious. And the whole thing, the sentence structure is all gushing, bleeding with this erotic femininity. And I mean that in the best of ways. It's tragically luscious, right? It's the precursor to the melancholic tidal wave that is a Virginia Woolf. Sometimes, after an hour of apathy, my strange and beautiful companion would take my hand and hold it with fond pressure, renewed again and again, blushing softly, gazing in my face with languid and burning eyes, and breathing so fast that her dress rose and fell with the tumultuous respiration. It was like the ardor of a lover. It embarrassed me. It was hateful and yet overpowering, and with gloating eyes she drew me to her, and her hot lips traveled along my cheek in kisses, and she would whisper almost in sobs, "You are mine, you shall be mine, and you and I are one forever." The lesbian factor is fairly racy, even by today's standards, actually. Especially in a Europe which was, at that time, more or less completely sexually repressed. I know the light is like... So it's unsurprising that the Carmilla served as sort of like the foundation for all the cheap, sleazy 70s erotic vampire movies, in Europe or otherwise. But the novel in itself, I feel, retains a good deal of sophistication. For example, the Danish master filmmaker Carl Dreyer actually loosely adapted it into his film Vampire from the 30s, either the late 20s or the 30s. Great film, totally ominous, creepy, really good stuff. The real beauty of Gothic literature is that it is constantly challenging our convictions of what is human and what it means to be human. We're usually too conventional in our acceptance of what it means to be human, says David Punter, and with every ounce of my body, I agree with that statement. Nevertheless, life and death are mysterious states, and we know little of the resources of either, says Le Fanu in the book. So exactly, obviously, the challenging of the conviction of what death is, what life is for that matter, what is human. Generally upsetting previously held rules, That's the beauty of Gothic literature. And obviously, for that reason, it's disturbing. But it's the best. So yeah, go, get it, go. You guys can read it in a day. It's totally easy. It's fantastic. It's really great, atmospheric, brilliant little lesbian vampire story. So, let me know if you guys want more Gothic literature. There's a plethora of great stuff from way back when, including earlier stuff than this, like The Monk, which I actually have not read yet, which I should. So let me know if you want to hear about more Gothic literature this season. We don't have to just cap it at Halloween. I mean, I can go, it's gonna get dark. Hope you're staying warm wherever you are in the world and that you're doing well and reading a lot of great books and enjoying some hot coffee if that's your thing. Always remember that life is far too short to read bullshit. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise, and the light is coming in, so I'm about to evaporate. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you guys next week. Ciao.